No explosions, no declarations of war, no dramatic exits from summits or flags torn from buildings. Just two leaders, a closed door, and 3 hours that will echo through European history for decades. When Giorgia Meloni and Viktor Orban walked out of that room together, they were not carrying a joint statement. They were carrying something far more dangerous, a verdict, a cold, documented, structurally built verdict on the European Union and the unelected woman who runs it. And the most terrifying part for Brussels is not what they said inside that room. It is what they proved is now possible simply by being in it together. Because when Italy moves, the ground moves. Not the ground under one difficult leader on the eastern fringe that Brussels has spent years dismissing, marginalizing, and financially punishing into irrelevance. The ground under the entire European project, the third largest economy in the Eurozone, a founding member, a G7 nation, the country without whose signature the European Union would never have existed in the first place. That country just stood next to Viktor Orban and smiled. And Ursula von der Leyen, the most powerful unelected executive in the Western world, the woman who has survived pandemics and wars and financial crises and 5 years of opposition from every direction, looked at that image and had no answer. She still does not have one. And the clock is running. To understand why what happened between Rome and Budapest this week represents something genuinely new in European politics, you need to understand the system that just broke. Not the formal system, not the treaties and the institutions and the official governance architecture that Brussels produces glossy documents about. The real system, the unspoken system, the one that has actually been running European politics for 30 years underneath all the official language about shared values and democratic cooperation. The real system operates on one foundational assumption so deeply embedded in European institutional culture that nobody in Brussels ever felt the need to say it out loud. The big nations will always ultimately comply. Germany leads, France agrees, Italy grumbles, negotiates, extracts concessions, and then falls into line. The smaller nations watch the big nations and follow. And the entire edifice of Brussels authority rests on that sequence, repeating itself reliably enough that the Commission can issue directives, freeze funds, launch condemnation procedures, and apply financial pressure with the absolute confidence that the architecture will hold. That confidence is gone, not weakened, not shaken. Gone. Because Italy did not grumble and negotiate and extract concessions and fall into line. Italy walked into a room with the leader that Brussels has spent a decade trying to destroy and walked out his equal partner in a structural challenge to everything the Commission under von der Leyen represents. And it did so without apology, without diplomatic softening, and without leaving Brussels any face-saving interpretation to work with. The meeting at Palazzo Chigi was not spontaneous. That is the first thing you need to understand about what happened in Rome. This was not two frustrated leaders venting to each other over shared grievances and accidentally producing a political earthquake. Every element of this meeting was chosen with deliberate precision. The location carries 5 centuries of Italian executive power in its walls. When Orban walked through those doors and Meloni received him as a full and equal partner rather than a controversial figure to be managed at careful diplomatic distance, the message required no translation for anyone fluent in the language of European institutional politics. Budapest and Rome were no longer operating within Brussels' framework. They were building their own. And they were building it in public in one of the most symbolically loaded addresses in European history, daring the Commission to respond in a way that would prove every accusation they were making. Von der Leyen's response proved it immediately. Her office issued statements. Officials expressed concern. The Commission machinery produced its standard language about unity and shared values and the importance of constructive engagement among member states. All of it landed with the political impact of a paper airplane thrown at a reinforced wall. Because the problem Brussels is facing is not that Meloni and Orban said something inflammatory or provocative or factually questionable. The problem is that what they said is true, and an institution that has spent years using the language of democracy and European values to insulate itself from genuine democratic accountability has no clean answer to the truth when it arrives with the full institutional weight of two major governments behind it. Start with migration, because this is where Italy's anger is not abstract and not political. It is physical, it is daily, it is bodies washing up on Italian shores and boats arriving in numbers that overwhelm the capacity of coastal communities that have been asking Brussels for real solutions for a decade and receiving lectures, committees, quota systems, and paperwork in return. Italy has been living this crisis in a way that no landlocked Central European nation and no Northern European country protected by geography from the direct human consequences of failed Mediterranean border policy ever has. Brussels designed a quota system that asked member states to absorb a symbolically distributed number of migrants and presented this administrative exercise as a serious policy response to a humanitarian emergency that was killing people in the water. Hungary refused the quota system entirely. When Brussels threatened financial punishment for rejecting even the minimum allocation, Orban did not blink. He looked at the financial threat and told Brussels essentially that Hungary would absorb the penalty rather than surrender control of its own borders. That position made him easy to dismiss for years. He was the difficult one, the unreasonable one. The leader whose refusal to cooperate could be blamed for the policy's failure rather than the policy's fundamental inadequacy. But when Italy stands next to that position and says, "We understand exactly why you said no," the entire dismissal framework collapses instantly. It is no longer one difficult leader holding everyone back. It is a founding member and a Central European nation asking the same question simultaneously with the combined economic and political weight of two major governments behind every word. Why is Brussels more interested in punishing the nations that protect their borders than in actually solving the crisis at the border? That question has no clean answer. The EU migration policy has failed by every measurable standard that matters to ordinary people living with the consequences. The numbers do not improve. The deaths in the Mediterranean do not stop. The political pressure on frontline member states does not ease. The burden sharing that Brussels promised never materializes in the form that the nations carrying the burden actually need. What happens instead is more summits, more statements, more frameworks, more promises that dissolve the moment the cameras turn off and the next crisis demands attention. Meloni has watched this cycle repeat itself for years with the focused attention of someone who has to explain it to Italian citizens who are living it. In Rome, standing next to Orban, she made her position on that cycle official. Not personal frustration, not national policy expressed in isolation. A formal, two-nation, documented stance that the current approach to migration cannot be defended, cannot be reformed through incremental adjustment, and cannot be sustained politically by the governments expected to implement it. The energy dimension of what came out of Rome cuts even deeper into the mythology Brussels has spent years constructing around its own agenda. The EU's green transition has been the single largest expansion of Commission regulatory authority in the institution's history. Under the banner of climate targets and carbon neutrality deadlines, Brussels inserted itself into national energy markets, industrial policy, household consumption patterns, and economic planning in ways that transferred enormous decision-making power from elected national governments to an unelected commission that answers to no population and faces no electoral consequence for the damage its mandates cause. Orban looked at the energy transition timeline Brussels was demanding and did the arithmetic that Brussels refused to do honestly. He calculated what eliminating Russian energy dependence on Brussels' schedule would cost the Hungarian economy, Hungarian industry, and Hungarian families trying to heat their homes through Central European winters. The numbers did not work. He said no, not dramatically, not ideologically, practically. Because practical governance requires matching policy to economic reality rather than economic reality to policy preference. And while European press coverage spent years framing his refusal as ideological obstruction, Hungarian businesses kept functioning and Hungarian households kept their energy bills at levels that did not force the impossible choices between heating and eating that were becoming routine in countries that followed Brussels mandates with more obedience and less arithmetic. Meloni faces the same reality from Italian geography. Italy's energy situation is complex, expensive, and structurally dependent on import relationships that cannot be redrawn overnight because an unelected commissioner published a new directive. Italian industry, Italian geography, and Italian economic reality require energy policies built around Italian conditions, not policies copied from a centralized template designed in Brussels by people who measure the success of the green transition in press release language rather than in the lived experience of the families and businesses absorbing its costs. Together in Rome, Orban and Meloni issued a challenge to the EU energy establishment that von der Leyen has no honest answer to. Manage your own energy transition according to your own economic reality. Stop treating practical necessity as ideological betrayal. Stop using energy policy as another instrument of centralized control over national governments that were elected to govern their own nations. And then there is the money. Because the financial dimension of what was discussed behind those closed doors in Rome may be the most structurally explosive element of everything that came out of that meeting. Brussels has frozen billions in funds owed to Hungary, not aid from outside the system, funds that Hungary contributed to and is owed under the terms of its own membership in the European Union. Withheld not because Hungary violated a treaty obligation, but because the Commission under von der Leyen decided that Hungary's elected government held domestic policy positions that Brussels disapproved of. Meloni looked at that mechanism and recognized it with the clarity of someone whose own government has faced Brussels budget pressure, deficit warnings, and financial leverage applied against Italian economic policy decisions that did not fit the approved Brussels model. The message from Rome on the financial question was delivered without diplomatic softening. You cannot build a union on financial coercion. You can only build resentment. And resentment, when it organizes itself across enough nations with enough economic weight behind it, stops being something Brussels can manage with a committee report and becomes something Brussels cannot stop with any tool currently in its possession. That organization is already happening, and the governments watching from Warsaw, Vienna, Prague, and Bratislava are not watching with casual interest. They are watching with the focused attention of people doing political calculations in real time, running the numbers, assessing the costs, asking the question that Rome just made possible to ask seriously for the first time. If Italy can do this without being destroyed, what exactly are the rest of us still afraid of? Von der